I have loved spy fiction for a long time. I've been an avid reader of it. It's one of my very favorite genres. But something I couldn't help noticing in reading all of these spy thrillers it's that most of them are written by men and most of them feature male protagonists. And I do think this is starting to change a little bit these days, but I was very struck by this, and I'd always loved the spy fiction of, the masters like John le Carré, where they have um, a lot of sort of subtle character development layered in there, and things are gray. It's not all black and white. There's that moral ambiguity. I always loved that. So I thought I want to channel some of that spirit in my own novel, but I want the women to be in charge. So that was kind of the guiding principle I took with me into the Helsinki Affair. And I have to say, it was really fun writing a spy thriller where there were some strong women at the center of the story. So that's just a little bit about me and about the book.
Was there any particular woman or spy, women spies that you did research on that you were able to like bounce your characters off of?
It's a good question. So I did do a lot of research, and in particular did a lot of research for Our American Friend, which had those spy elements, and then kind of built on that body of research for the Helsinki Affair. But I found that there weren't that many accounts in the research I did do of, female case officers running these big operations, certainly during the Cold War and even in present day. So I would say it's not until more recently that I've found some real life examples of women where I want to incorporate certain elements or inspiration. There's this fabulous book that came out in the fall. It's a nonfiction book called The Sisterhood by Liza Mundy. I don't know if anyone's heard of it or read about it, but it's about the women of the CIA who have been so often overlooked. And I found that even in the research I did, like a lot of the histories, the nonfiction accounts I read of the CIA and the Cold War, the women are pretty minor in the story, which I don't think is always an accurate reflection of their importance, but it certainly felt a little overlooked. But one thing that was quite funny that I did encounter in the research process is in 2019, when I was writing my previous novel, I had the chance to spend an afternoon at Langley at the CIA headquarters and meet with a couple people there. They do this sometimes. They'll invite in novelists or screenwriters from Hollywood and, talk to them for a few hours, answer some questions they may have. And I think this is all in an effort to make sure that the depiction of the CIA in books and movies has a little bit more nuance and isn't so cliched, maybe. And one of the women I was speaking to during this afternoon, she's an in-house psychologist at the CIA. So she really dives into the motivations and the interior lives of these spies. She said to me, "I'm really glad to hear that you're putting women at the center of your story, but I just have to ask you, please don't make this female character some kind of sex crazed nutcase." And I was like, wow, okay. I mean, I wasn't planning on that, and that is not the case. But she said it in a kind of pointed way where I thought, oh, wow, she is very tired of seeing these women in movies, TV shows, books depicted as either, these sort of sexual temptresses or otherwise like kind of off their rocker, if you will. So I thought that was sort of interesting in terms of how women often get treated in the genre.
Do you think that because your main character was a woman, that she had to deal with the sort of moral and ethical elements more than your male characters did? I mean, she seemed to have more of an issue grappling with, loyalty to the CIA, loyalty to her father, than her father ever had about loyalty to his wife in his relationship with Mary.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's so true. I think her father, Charlie, is a much simpler person in some ways and makes some extremely foolish mistakes as a result. He maybe doesn't have the same kind of emotional subtlety, or let's just call it emotional intelligence, that his daughter possesses. And I hesitate to draw like totally blanket generalizations about, one sex versus the other, because of course, men and women come in all shapes and sizes. But I will say, I find from my own like lived experience, when I'm with my girlfriends, we can spend, hours and hours talking about people and feelings and motivations and like what makes a person tick. Like we can really dive deeply into that, and find it really interesting. Conversely, when I've spent time with men, I find that they're less inclined to kind of dive into those sort of wanting to understand what makes a person tick. Obviously, that's a huge generalization. I know plenty of men who are interested in that, but it's always struck me that that would be a really useful skill to possess if you were a spy, because so much of being a spy is being able to read another person's motivations, understand what they're thinking, put yourself in their shoes. And so the more time you've spent like really making the effort to do that, the likely you are to succeed and do well as a spy. And I think that's one of probably many reasons that Amanda is much further along and has a much more successful career than, her father ever did.
Barbara, you had your hand up before. I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
No, I mentioned that Mary used sex to entrap Cole.
Mm-hmm.
So you still stayed with that same way of thinking.
Yeah, it's true. Well, so Mary, I think it's definitely true. And, you can argue whether or not this is a good thing, that I spent a lot more time trying to make sure that the main female characters, so in this case, it's really Amanda and Kath to a certain extent as well. They're the ones who get the kind of more nuanced and subtle treatment. But Mary's maybe like a little bit more of a secondary character, and she's definitely a bit of a villain in this story. And sometimes with the villains in the story, you can make it a little bit more you can sort of dial up those qualities that are a little, what's the word I'm looking for? A little more familiar from certain genre tropes, let's say.
I found that too. I think it was Semenov who seemed to be the most, I don't know, the most pure character in terms of his motivation. I mean, he was consistent. He was like a good guy throughout.
Yes.
Nobody else was a purely good guy or
Yes.
purely bad guy, except
Yes.
Semenov was purely good throughout.
Yeah. Yeah, I really loved writing Semenov, and I felt so much like love and tenderness in my heart for him as I was writing those scenes. And I think it's really fun in spy fiction to explore how people wind up spying for another country through all sorts of means. So in the instance of Charlie, he's entrapped by Mary and essentially blackmailed into spying for Russia. So it's something he did out of his own, it came about because of his own foolishness and stupidity, really. Whereas Semenov chooses to spy for America because he really does have that pure idealism. He doesn't like the way things are going in Russia, and he believes in certain ideals that, the Americans are working towards. And he wants a chance at a different kind of life. And I think that's really, noble and admirable when someone does this thing, which is hugely risky. Like it could go wrong and he could have his life. I mean, his life is in jeopardy in this book. But yeah, I think so many of the characters in the story are a mixture of like a little bit good and a little bit bad, lots of shades of gray. But it's nice every once in a while to have a character like Semenov, who is, as you said, Carolyn, just sort of purely good.
where do you get your source, information for, I mean, I know it's fiction, but where do you get the information to know how to write like this, this type of subject?
So it's a lot of research, and I would say that research is primarily done through reading. So, thank goodness I have access to a good library in my neighborhood, because I have relied so heavily on that for research throughout the years. And there are a lot of great nonfiction accounts of certainly the Cold War, the CIA, the KGB, and, more contemporary memoirs by spies as well. And you're only ever going to get so much from the research, because of course there's a lot that a former spy is not going to discuss or reveal, but you do start to pick up some of the lingo, some of the tradecraft techniques just through reading all of this material. You learn about things like dead drops or brush passes, or how spies might get signals from one to the other. And I find that stuff really, it's really fun to include those little details. And I often find that in order to write spy fiction that hopefully feels somewhat realistic, and of course there are plenty of things I have to make up because I don't actually know how they work, but in order to write spy fiction that feels somewhat realistic, you have to do more research than you're actually going to include in the book. So it's just trying to immerse oneself in that world as much as possible. And I also find it's really inspiring to read spy fiction by other authors, to just see the way that they, write an action scene or describe a dynamic between a handler and a spy. It really, it kind of enlivens my imagination and makes me think, oh, like maybe I could borrow some of those techniques in my own fiction.
When you were in St. Petersburg in the book, you brought back memories when I had a trip there. Described it very well.
Oh, good. Good. I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah, I had a chance to go to St. Petersburg in 2019, not long before, the pandemic shut everything down. And I was only there for a few days, but my God, it was such a beautiful city. It left a big impression on me. And it was really fun to be able to sort of revisit those places in my imagination. So I'm glad to hear that it rang true to your memories of the place as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think there's someone in I don't know, the CIA or somebody that goes through all these books to make sure you don't hitting too close to anything that might be real?
That would be an interesting job for sure. So I know that when you are a former employee of the CIA, and this might also apply to anyone who's worked in any kind of national security capacity. So it might also apply if you've worked in the military or at the NSA or the FBI. I'm not sure, but I know it's definitely true if you used to work for the CIA and then you leave the CIA and you decide to write a book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you are required to share that book with the agency before it's published, and they'll go through it and mark the things that you have to take out or require you to change certain details or omit certain stories because they don't want you revealing, potentially the identity of assets who are still in the field undercover or give away certain, secrets about operations. So I know that's often the case. And sometimes it creates contention between writers and the CIA, because the CIA might say you have to take all this stuff out, and the writer decides to go ahead and publish the book anyways. And then sometimes litigation ensues and all of that. But if you've never worked for the CIA, which I have not, you don't have to show them anything. You don't owe them anything. I'm sure that they would, if you're someone who's including details in your novel that feel very similar to things that are really happening that are secretly really happening. I'm sure they'll sort of be curious about where are you getting your information from. I don't think I've gotten to the level where any of that's true, but I do know that there are, great masters of spy fiction, like David Ignatius is an example of a writer who's working today. And he's known for writing spy novels that are very true to current events, sometimes to the extent that he's almost like anticipating what's going to show up in the news next year. And I think he's also known to have lots of sources within the CIA who maybe like slip him little tidbits every now and then of like, oh, you should write a story about such and such happening in China. And so that makes the books feel very realistic indeed.
I did like how you actually gave Charlie the opportunity to make amends at the end and let him do it in a more creative way. I mean, just sitting in prison wasn't going to do anybody good. It wasn't going to make him feel better. But he was actually going to be able to do something to truly make amends.
Yes.
And get revenge on me.
And yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really important moment for Charlie, because he's been living with this regret, and even more than regret, like a lot of shame for those years in which he's kept it a secret. He's kept it entirely to himself. And I think that's often, when you've done something that you're really ashamed of that caused a lot of pain and suffering to other people, and you don't tell anyone about it, I think it just makes the burden heavier and heavier. So I do think that, Charlie has a long way to go. It's a long path to redemption, for sure. But he's taking the first initial steps down that road when he says, I'm willing to do this operation. I want to try and make something good come out of all of this. So despite all of Charlie's foolishness and many mistakes and the fact that he's like kind of a dope for a lot of the story, I do have this soft spot in my heart for him because he's kind of clueless, but by the end of the book, he's certainly recognized how wrong he got it. And I think he's determined not to make those mistakes again. And what's been fun is I'm working on the next novel right now, and these characters are actually going to continue into the next book. And this is a first for me. I've never written like continuing characters or a series before. And so, we have Amanda and we have Kath and we have Charlie, and it's been really interesting to start to explore like where are they all going to go next. So yeah, there'll be more from them in the future.
I'd like to hear more about Maurice. He's everybody's confidant.
Yes.
Much about him.
Yeah.
I found him very interesting.
Yeah. I find Maurice really interesting too. And it's funny you bring that up. I was having dinner with a friend just last night, and she was saying, Maurice is kind of my favorite, but I don't really know, like, what's his deal? What's he up to? And the truth is, I love Maurice as well. And he's one of my favorite characters to write. But he is a character who, even though, I've sort of made him up and put him on the page, he's mysterious to me as well. So it's not like I have this whole backstory of Maurice in my mind and I just didn't include it in the book. It's like, I'm not quite sure myself, all these details of his personal life. He's a bit mysterious to me as well. And perhaps I'll have the chance to dive more deeply into him in future books. But I like the fact that he is a little bit of a shapeshifter. I think he's an incredibly intelligent person. I think he's both sort of intellectually brilliant, but also quite emotionally intelligent in the way that, Amanda has those same skills as we were talking about earlier. Maurice is really good at reading people and figuring out, when they might be holding something back. He detects that in Charlie when Charlie is sort of lying to him at certain points in Helsinki. And I am always curious. I'm like, how did Maurice get to be this way? What is it in his own upbringing, his own past, or his own experience that made him so sort of perceptive and so comfortable with, gaining other people's trust. So I do hope I have the chance to explore that. But I also really enjoy writing the scenes with Maurice because I'm never quite sure what he's going to say or how he's going to react. He always surprises me a little bit.
How many real characters have you taken from their lives to put in your book? Such as this idea of not bringing home your work. As an attorney who is always involved in something but can't bring it home, and at some point wants to get away from it, and that you do at the end with the bike riding. Is reading what he missed. In other words, where'd you come up with that concept? And somebody wakes up and finds out after 50 years they've missed everything.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a good question. And I'll say that often when I'm writing those scenes, like where Charlie's kind of having this late in life realization that, I've missed so much of my life, or I'm this kind of recognition of his own loneliness. It's not something where I necessarily know going into the scene that that's precisely the theme I'm going to explore. It kind of just comes out organically. This may not be a terribly satisfying answer to the question, but I find that I'm able to arrive at the truest insights into a character if I let them steer the way through a given scene. So, at that point, it's near the end of the book. I've spent quite a lot of time with Charlie, and so I have a decent sense of him. And as I'm writing, I try not to think about it too much. I try to almost like let the character chart his own course through a given scene. So that's the sort of thing where it almost emerges from the subconscious, maybe. That's always such a big part of the most mysterious part of the writing process, is the things that as you're sitting there typing, you're like, oh wow, I didn't know I was necessarily going to say that. But I think that that's the sort of thing about life that you just observe as long as you're curious about people. So, I don't know anyone who's just like Charlie, certainly not, but I know plenty of people who have regrets about the course of their life, or who, wonder whether they did the right thing, or who have some degree of loneliness. And, if you're curious about people and you want to understand what makes them feel the way they feel, it's a really good way of kind of gathering together these insights that will wind up peppering throughout your fiction. So it's hard for me to trace that to any specific inspiration, but it's just, it's through knowing people and talking to people and reading lots of other novels and watching movies and all of that you start to notice these patterns.
Getting to what you just said, this idea of where we're going in the future with AI is something that's very disturbing, because everybody's going to copy from previous work and not creating new work. That's what's interesting to me, because Kandinsky, the painter, wrote everything is copied. That there's nothing really new, and that you just can't create something new. Where do you get the material from? You don't look at it, because I could have said you got the material in this book from following Trump, the discovery of all the material he put in a closet. And I would have said, well, did she start to write the book after she read about that or anything else? In other words, what gave you the idea, let's write this book about this concept?
So what, sorry, is the question what gave me the idea?
Where did you get the concept that people are going to be discovered through just looking at information that doesn't directly relate to them? Namely, you keep on following the dots in order to discover who this is, because that was the only one that possibly could have been there, such as Komorowski. He had to be there because he was in Iceland at a certain time and something happened. Where did you get that concept for? Because it's almost brilliant, because what you're doing is you're then saying he's playing the market. Now all of a sudden you're playing the market, and now you're playing with the idea that they're not going to produce the weapons that are necessary unless they get paid for them. And if they get paid, they're going to work for the other side to get paid instead of to produce what they have to do.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. Yeah. The question of, where I got that idea, that concept of certain companies being manipulated by the stock market, and the outcomes that would change as a result of that, like the weapons manufacturing. The inspiration that I took from the real world for that wasn't specifically about, let's say, a weapons manufacturer. But one thing I had noticed in reading the news in past years is that there are certain American companies that are so massive and so connected all around the world, and they're selling their product in many different places, not just America, but also, Russia, China, places in Europe, that they are often affected by and have to be sensitive to the demands or the requirements of those other overseas markets. So there's been this kind of long simmering controversy for a company like Disney, which is obviously this very powerful American company, that it came out that Disney was making certain alterations to some of their movies, or almost like censoring some of their movies in order to be permitted to show those movies in China, because China, the Chinese government, I think, had certain requirements around what could or could not be shown. And so they made changes to their business as a result of these foreign governments, which are sometimes adversaries of America, wanting something else. And I just find that very interesting, because it's an instance where an American company, is sort of exporting American values in a way. But once they become caught up in foreign markets and they want to keep, a foreign audience equally happy, or keep a foreign government equally happy, then suddenly they have to be sort of serving two masters at once. So I was always intrigued by this idea that a lot of what makes America very powerful on the world stage is not just the American government, it's really these American companies. Like when you think about Disney or Coca-Cola or, Boeing or anything, it's like these are companies that do a lot of business all over the world, and, a lot of money's moving around, and that can be very powerful for America, but it might also leave America susceptible to foreign influence via these companies. So I wanted to explore the idea that a foreign government, Russia in this case, instead of targeting, the White House or the American government, would instead look at this very big, very powerful American company and think, how can we manipulate them into doing something for us? And in the case of Komorowski, they find a way of manipulating the price of the stock such that they sort of tell them what to do. So yeah, that's the kind of thing where, you know, reading the news and seeing what weird things are going on in the world can plant those little seeds of an idea.
I could tell for some reason that you were well read. The author was well read, you know. I don't know what it was. I think it was the combination of the stock market, also a worldliness, all the different locations, but the character development is fascinating.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, I have to compliment you.
Thank you. Thank you. I am very happy to hear that. I always try when I'm writing these novels to, you know, not try to plot it out too much ahead of time. I often find when I'm starting a story, you know, I might know what's going to happen in the first scene and maybe the few scenes after that, but I can't predict exactly how a character is going to react if I don't know them very well. And I don't really get to know a character well until I've actually spent that time with them writing the book. The metaphor I often use is, you know, when you meet someone for the first time, like you're at a dinner party or at some kind of function, and you see them across the room, you spend 5 minutes talking to them. It's like you can describe what they look like and maybe the tone of their voice and certain other very obvious parts of their personality, but you don't really know them that well. You know, it's not until you've spent several hours talking with them, you know, you've done different things with them, that you have a deeper understanding of who they are and what kind of decisions they might make. And for me, it's the same is true with my characters. So, you know, I might describe Amanda at the beginning of the story, but I don't really know her that well. And it's not until I've written many, many scenes with her that I think, okay, this is kind of who this woman is. This is what her personality is like. This is what her motivations are like. And if I let the characters sort of show me who they are gradually, I find that they wind up being much stronger by the end of the story, as opposed to me at the beginning of the story trying to say, okay, well, she's going to be brave or cowardly or strong or weak or, you know, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because listening to you from the very beginning tonight, when you speak of the characters, what I find interesting is you speak as if they're real people and you're slowly learning them, just like
Yeah.
one normally slowly learns people, you know,
Yeah.
as you continuously interact with them or meet up with people.
Yeah.
Whereas I get the impression from other authors, it's like there's a decided personality when at the very beginning in their mind.
Mhm.
There isn't. And maybe that's why the characters are so interesting to me.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. They definitely do feel real to me, to the point where like I walk around thinking about them and sometimes I get a little creeped out. I'm like, oh my God, I spend all my time thinking about these not real people, but they do feel very, very real to me. I mean, I spend, if you think about it, I spend more time with them than anyone else in my life, except for my husband. Like that's it though, where those are my people. So yeah, it's kind of funny.
I also like the relationship between Kath and Amanda, how they understood each other and how they
Yes.
bonded. Even
Yeah.
though there was just a working relationship, it became more than just a working relationship.
Yeah. I loved writing Kath. And I'm so happy to hear you enjoyed that too. Kath she was a ton of fun. Like as soon as she walked onto the page, she was such a strong personality from the get-go. And I was like, oh wow, this woman kind of took me by surprise. But what I love about them is that they work really well together. She and Amanda have a really strong bond, but they're two very different people. They're different in terms of their personality, but also, and I think this is crucial, Kath is a lot older than Amanda. And I think in a way she's much more comfortable with herself. Like she knows who she is. She embraces who she is. She doesn't really care what the bosses tell her. She does what she wants. She has that confidence. And Amanda is still kind of figuring it out. She's still growing up and learning how to navigate the world. And so she has a lot to learn from Kath. And I love the idea that she has this, very sassy and strong older woman in her life to kind of show her the ropes a little bit. So, yeah.
What's your methodology in writing the book? It seems like you start out and you just start writing. How much, like when you get up to chapter 3, how much of chapter 1 are you rewriting because character has changed in your mind?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say I do a lot of revision, a lot of rewriting. And because I generally start writing my books without an outline or without a strong sense of where the plot's going to go, it means that the draft, as I'm working on it, is really long and full of tangents and, this whole mishmash of things that don't necessarily wind up coalescing. But I do try when I'm working on a draft to kind of push forward towards the end as much as I can, even if I recognize that, oh gosh, now that I'm halfway through the book, I can understand that those scenes in chapter 2 or chapter 3 didn't make a whole lot of sense. But rather than like going back and trying to fix that, I'll try to push through, because generally by the time I get to the end of the book or close to the end, that's when I start to gain a sense of, oh, okay, this is what the book is really, these are going to be the climactic scenes. This is going to be the main central theme of the book. And at that point, I'll start over with a second draft. And I'm really like rewriting with the second draft. A lot changes between the first draft and the second draft. Like I'll go so far as to like retype in entire, scenes or chapters. So in the Helsinki Affair, for instance, I knew that it was going to start with this Russian defector walking into the embassy and that, this conspiracy would start to unravel, but I didn't know exactly where it would take me. And it wasn't until I got to near the end of the book that I realized that Amanda and Charlie's relationship, the father-daughter relationship, was going to play such a central role. Initially, I thought, okay, well, maybe Charlie's going to be sort of like a minor character and then he'll move over here. But as I wrote that first draft, it's like, oh, wow, Charlie and Amanda, they're really central to this story. And so I then went back to the beginning. I started a new draft. And with that in mind, I was able to rewrite the book so that it felt a lot like more focused and tighter. So it's not a very efficient process because I do wind up rewriting almost the entire book, but I find that it's a good way for me to sort of let the book unfold in the way that it needs to, without worrying too much about getting it just right in the first draft.
What happens when the editors get involved?
So I've been lucky enough to work with the same editor for all 4 of my books, and she's brilliant. And I really treasure our relationship because we've kind of grown up together. So she knows my work really well. She knows my, flaws and foibles and all of my patterns. And so because we've worked together for so long, we have quite a good shorthand. So she doesn't even need to tell me like everything that's wrong with the book. She can give a sort of high level diagnosis and say, I didn't really believe this character's arc, or I didn't think that this scene was strong enough. Like, can you do more with this or less with that? So she tends to weigh in on the level of like the kind of overall story architecture and characters' motivations, that kind of thing. She doesn't tend to like change a lot on a line by line level, which I appreciate. Like she doesn't meddle with it too much, for lack of a better word. And we're often in agreement, but we do sometimes disagree. And at the end of the day, it's my name on the cover of the book and I have to stand by the words on the page. So if we have a disagreement and she says, I think you should delete this paragraph, and I say, I think that's a really important paragraph, she'll generally let me get away with it. So she has a lot of input and a lot of influence over the book, but it is sort of, if there's a strong disagreement, she'll usually understand that, I have a method to the madness, as it were.
You worked in the book industry for a long period of time. before you became an author. Isn't that correct? Isn't that correct?
Working at Random House before I became an author? Yes, that's right. I worked as an editor at Random House for just about 8 years, and it was great. I really loved that job, and for a long time I thought, I don't want to leave. I love being an editor, and I was doing two things. I was doing both things at the same time. I wrote my first 2 novels in the mornings before work, before I'd go into the office. And yet at a certain point, I just started to feel like kind of burned out from doing both things, because they're both, demanding jobs in their own way. And it was about 5.5 years ago that I decided, you know what, I have to step back from the editing, and I felt ready to focus entirely on the writing and give more of my time to that. And I'm really glad I made that decision. I don't regret it for a second, but I think I also learned a lot from working as an editor. It taught me a lot about story, a lot about like pacing and structure, and how to make sure, a story is exciting from the very first page. So I often say it's like the best writing education I could have ever received. And it's helpful too, because it taught me a little bit about how the industry works, the role that marketing plays or publicity plays or sales, or just all those kind of behind the scenes pieces that you don't learn about in school, certainly.
Is it financially rewarding? Versus
No, I mean, it can be for certain writers. I'm not there yet. It's okay. It's like I do some freelance editing, and that helps to make up for the fact that book advances are not terribly high and also not predictable. Like I've had the amount of money I've gotten paid for my books has varied, and it's hard to predict how well a book is going to sell or not sell. So there's always a lot of uncertainty to it. Like this is not a predictable, stable salary job, but you have to sort of do the best you can, and save money from one book to the other. And I do find that like freelance editing can be a nice way to both keep my editing skills a little bit in the mix, and you can supplement the income through different things.
Have you been approached by Hollywood to do a movie?
I've had some conversations in the past few months with some producers and writers out in Hollywood for the Helsinki Affair, and there is interest in potentially adapting it for TV or film. And so we're having more of those conversations. We're going to see where it goes. I always take it with an enormous grain of salt, because if I've learned one thing about Hollywood from my experience, it's like, you have no idea what's going to happen. And even if they, what's called option your book and, secure the rights to it and try to put something together, they'll write a script, they'll try to get an actor or actress attached. It's like, it's still always a long shot, but I love the idea of it maybe making it to the screen someday, and I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed. So hopefully.
I have a friend, a gentleman I know. I mean, I haven't seen him in a while, but he wrote a book, a true story, because he worked for the FBI years ago. He's since left and now he's a DA. But he wrote a book, I forget the actual name, and I read it. And actually the movie, the American Hustler with Bradley Cooper.
Oh, yeah.
Is to the T his book. It's the entire story is true.
Wow.
Who actually plays him.
Wow, that's very cool.
Everything in that movie is true. However, now you have to remember, he was in the FBI, and he worked undercover, and he then make a long story short, he then left, was a lawyer, and then became a DA. All right, and now he's a lawyer. Hollywood never approached him. They just made that book. It's verbatim from his book. There's a,
Hmm.
this is very common with Hollywood now. It has been
Mhm.
years now.
Mhm.
To even talk to you, because, you know, Hollywood, it's like, you know, everything is about the budget. So it's like, well, we won't pay the writer. We just get the,
Mhm.
so you have to be very careful.
Yes. Oh, yes, for sure. And
He's in the FBI of all the, and he's a lawyer, and to do
yeah,
it like him, I
yeah.
find it bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. And I know that there's a sort of whole different set of rules for when they're adapting something from real life versus fiction. And I do think that with fiction, there's funnily enough, more of a sort of copyright protection inherent in the book you've written. Because like if someone goes and makes a movie starring Amanda Cole and Kath Frost and all of this, it's pretty clear that they took it from the novel. But when they're adapting it from real life, I think they can get away with a little more. I don't know how it works exactly, but it's like there's a whole different set of rules. So yeah, it's weird.
Feel
You're
like,
not allowed to write,
Mm.
being a lawyer, the matters that you worked on,
Mhm.
and especially if people are still alive, because while they're alive, they have a right to privacy.
Right,
And,
right.
it is found out that you have written about them, 83 million could happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to fall into a trap writing about something you're working on professionally as a lawyer, and then say this makes a good movie or makes a good book, because all these people are very creative who are called criminals.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they would not be criminals. They have to
Mm-hmm.
make money being grifters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
So you said you're working on the second book of this. Is there a timetable, or are you doing another book instead first, or is this the next one?
So it is the next one. The next book that I'm working on, the one I'm presently working on, is the follow-up to the Helsinki Affair with, more of Amanda, more of Kath, more of Charlie. And in terms of a timeline, I can't put a firm date on it yet, but my hope is to have a draft of this book done, let's say by the end of 2024, knock on wood. And, then there'll be some time for revision and all of that. But hopefully it won't take too long to get the next book out there into the world. Oh, Laureen, I think you're muted.
well, we'll have to follow you so we can read the sequel as soon as it comes out.
Yeah, I would love that. I'd love to come back and join this book club again sometime.
Wow.
That's wonderful. Okay, we're almost getting to the hour. So does anyone have anything else they want to ask Anna
How about you,
or
Dan?
comment about it? We appreciate your time and we wish you a lot of luck. And as the librarian who goes through see all the new books, I'll be keeping an eye out for it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me here this evening and for the fantastic questions. I really enjoyed this.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you guys. Have a good evening.